Let's welcome Philip McCann. He's Professor of Urban and Regional Economics at Sheffield University, and his understanding of economic geography and the insights that it allows is fascinating. Philip, please come and talk to us. This is probably too much technology for me.
Just
open the laptop.
I've already tested it and it doesn't work, so just give us a few seconds, it should be okay. This is what happened earlier, so hopefully. So I'll give you a background as to what I'm going to talk about. The first thing, obviously, I'm delighted to be here. It's a real honour and a privilege, and I'm extremely grateful to the organisers of the conference too. To have invited me to be here. It's a real privilege. I'm not a politician. I'm not an activist. I'm a scribbler. I'm an academic. I spend long periods, as in years and years and years, thinking about problems, working on bits, and so on. Now what I do is, or what I work on is, I work on why countries internally are so different. So in the case of, let's say in England, the North-South divide. In Italy, the South-North divide. In the US, the middle of the US versus the coasts. This is what I work on, and the relationship between those differences and trade. So it's the links between geography and trade. So why what we do in Edinburgh is different to what we do in Glasgow. Why what happens in Aberdeen is rather different to what happens in Glasgow, but it may have more connections to what happens, for example, in Bergen in Norway. And how do these relationships play out in space? Now, before I start, a great scholar called Angus Maddison, who if he'd stayed alive would have won a Nobel Prize, he was the person who built the OECD data sets on the historical growth of countries and development over 500 years. And he said, from all of his work over many years, that there were four kinds of countries. There were developing countries, developed countries, Japan and Argentina, because you just couldn't classify them. This is back in the 1980s. I actually think the UK is now an outlier on its own. And I'm going to try and demonstrate some things visually. My arguments come from a book. I wrote this, it's 566 pages, it's not an easy read, but it tries to explain the issues of inequality across space in the UK, why they're so extreme and why they have this particular characteristic. Basically, London in this core and everybody else. And everybody else is also rather different. But it's basically this problem. Why is it so pronounced in the UK? Now, this is the area I work on, but 95% of my work has not been about the UK. I've spent more than half of my career I've worked in 6 countries now. But the UK has always puzzled me, and I've never been happy with any of the explanations. And I've written many books, hundreds of articles and reports, but this is the biggest thing I ever took on. And as much as anything else, it was a personal journey out of curiosity. So let me show you some things about the UK. Obviously, all of you recognize these maps. Yellow is voting Remain, blue is voting Leave. These are from the BBC website. The ones on the side, the darker yellow is more Remain, the darker blue on the left is, on the right is a stronger Leave. Why did that happen in that particular way? I mean, obviously, if you look at the case of Scotland and Northern Ireland, many people say there's a cultural issue about identity, which is different to, let's say, many parts of England or Wales. So, of course, that's a clear argument. But it doesn't explain why England looks like the way it is. Because the areas that voted Remain, you see the yellow parts in the southeast of England. These are quintessentially very twee, small, villagey, conservative England. Places in Surrey, Berkshire, Buckinghamshire, Oxfordshire, Gloucestershire. They're as strongly English identity as anywhere else, but they have a completely different perspective to many other parts of England. You also see the same thing within Wales. Now, many people explain these things. It's to do with culture, identity, sovereignty, anti-immigration. You hear all these descriptions. We know that. And also we know things about characteristics of people. in terms of what kind of skills or jobs you do, tends to orient votes in one particular direction or another. We hear these things all the time. But what we do know now from the data which is emerging, very, very detailed data, is geography overlays everything. If you are in a locality which is very prosperous, whatever your personal characteristics are, you are more likely to vote Remain. Whereas if you're in a locality which is lacking in prosperity, you are more likely to vote Leave, whatever your personal characteristics are. And of course, we saw the same things in the recent presidential election in the United States. Almost every city over 1 million people voted Democrat. Why is this happening, and what does it tell us about how people think? Well, we've just published a paper called The Mismatch Between Local Voting and Local Economic Consequences of Brexit. It was just published last week. It's already had a lot of visibility. It deals with the issue that many people feel strongly that Europe and all of that was really about the metropolitan elites. Many of you have heard this phrase at all. Basically, the rich people in London, the big rollers, the highly influential people. These are kind of narratives that were played all the time, whereas the regular people, the common people, are left behind by what happens in Europe. Well, I work with a team in the Netherlands. I've just come back from the Netherlands after almost 8 years. I work in a team in the Netherlands that build the largest data sets in the world of trade and demand. So what happens if a Scottish region gets an export market, it could be anywhere, in China or in Germany, then they get contracts and then they subcontract to other companies, some of which will be in parts of Scotland, some of which will be in England, some of which will be in the Netherlands or Germany. How do you measure all those interactions across Europe, within the UK, within Scotland, across Scotland, and so on? And these are extremely sophisticated data sets. And we published a preliminary 3-page version of this a week before the referendum. It had about 7,500 views before the referendum. It had 23 million afterwards. It was the most tweeted image from the Financial Times in 2016. It was on the front page of the Washington Post. What does it tell us? Well, looking across all the European regions, all the trade demand interactions across the whole of Europe, what you see is this. On the horizontal axis is the proportion of people locally who voted Leave. On the vertical axis is the proportion of the local economy, which is dependent on consumption and investment markets in the rest of the European Union. The places that voted Leave are more economically dependent on the rest of Europe. The place which is the least dependent, the far left-hand corner at the bottom, is London. London is less dependent on European markets than any other place in the UK, but it had the strongest pro-Remain vote. Whereas the places that voted strongly to Leave are more dependent on Europe for their local prosperity than other places. It's also true if you look at wage income. So it's not just GDP per capita, including all capital payments. This is actually in terms of wage incomes. You get exactly the same effect. It's also not a sectoral issue. We hear lots of stuff at the moment, manufacturing and services. It's not about that. The way I explain it is this. What you see is the percentage of local manufacturing value added, which is dependent on markets in Europe, is strongly correlated with the percentage of local service industry value added, which is dependent on markets in Europe. An easy way to explain it is, I live in Birmingham. So imagine Jaguar Land Rover put out a contract and a local engineering company, which has been 3 or 4 generations in the Birmingham area, wins a contract, a tender with Jaguar Land Rover. That's going to see them through the next 5 to 8 years. So immediately what they do is they go to a local finance agent who's worked with that business for 3 or 4 generations. They know all about their technology, what they do. They go to local lawyers who know the engineering, know the company, know the background. They don't go to financial markets in the city because they can't afford it. And the city finances don't know about their local business. They do everything locally. And all those expenditure patterns are then spent on local schools, local housing, local entertainment. It's not a sectoral issue. It's about local economic dependence. Moreover, many people say, well, it's okay because we're going to have lots of new markets. Look at China. The demand effect of China on the UK economy, it's about 1/3 to half the size of the Manchester economy. It's about the same as the city of Leicester. Look at India. It's about the size of less than the effect of Portsmouth. These are real numbers. Post-Brexit impacts. Most UK regions are 50 to 100% more dependent on European markets than either London or parts of Scotland. And of course, that's the Aberdeen effect primarily, whereas the southwest of Scotland would look like most parts of England. It's closely correlated across different sectors, but most importantly, it's this, what I call a perception disconnection. People who were voting under very reasonable assumptions, voting leave, my guess is most people did not think they would be more adversely affected than the places which are voting remain. But the likelihood is that is true. Moreover, 90% of the UK's regions have become more dependent on European markets since the millennium. It's London which has become less dependent because it's the genuine global city of the whole country. Moreover, 2/3 of the UK's regions have actually become less dependent on London. What does this imply? Well, I argue that actually what's happening is the UK is decoupling or partitioning into 3 countries. Now, that's a very broad generalization, but it's just a characterization to help us think about what's happening and the complexities. The lower image was a front of the Spectator a few years ago. The interregional inequalities in the UK are amongst the worst in the industrialized world, and they've got worse and worse in the last 30 years. But on many levels, London and its immediate hinterland is simply decoupling from the rest of the UK. The UK is diverging, dislocating, decoupling. This is the language I use. You've got London and its immediate hinterland. Scotland, of course, is a different case since a lot of the institutional reforms over the last 2 decades. Scotland has been charting a different path. This is not an argument for or against independence. It's just a matter of fact of institutional changes. And then you've got a rump of the UK, which is basically drifting backwards. From a governance point of view, this is a real problem. In the UK, almost uniquely, is the extent to which this is what I would call a regional problem. It's not an urban problem, it's not a city question. If you talk about these things in the United States, people immediately talk about urban issues because they're most characterized by city-type issues in the United States. But in the UK, it's not that. I say, tell me the region the city's in, and I'll tell you how it's doing. But you can't do it the other way around. And it's primarily related to the differential impacts of globalization, of modern globalization since the late 1980s on the different parts of the UK economy. And the huge interregional imbalances in the UK, they're not a geography of education problem. They're not what economists call a spatial sorting, all the clever kids go to London. It's simply not true. And I document all this in enormous detail in my book. It's not about the size of cities. It's not about land use planning constraints. All these are issues. But fundamentally, globalization has hit different parts of the UK in very different ways. And so by OECD and EU standards, the UK today displays very high interregional imbalances on many, many levels in terms of incomes, wealth, employment status, job tenure, health indices, quality of life and well-being indices, artistic, cultural, heritage issues, town centre viability, educational research assets, infrastructure provision, political and media profiles. It's on almost every dimension. So the first thing is, internally, the UK is becoming incredibly imbalanced. So that's a problem for a start for government. But then the other side of it is, in the UK, it is also a governance problem, not just because the imbalances are so large, it's because we have an almost uniquely ill-equipped governance system to deal with it. The UK, on many indicators, is the world's most centralized governance system. And governance systems which are very top-down, what I call space-blind, they're not particularly about place, they're very sectoral, they're top-down, they're centralized, those work pretty well in countries which are very homogeneous internally, very equal. So I've just been living in the Netherlands the last 8 years. The Netherlands is incredibly equal internally. Before that, I was working in New Zealand. It's incredibly equal internally. But it's not about being small countries. Japan is incredibly equal. It's twice the size of the UK. It's not about size. In a country which is internally facing such huge imbalances, then it limits the capacity of governance systems to be effective. Because any policy you come up with, if it works, it's largely by chance. because the variation in the economy is so huge. In some places it will work, in other places it won't work. It's got very little traction. I mean, in some cases, we're so centralized, we actually look like a developing country. You know, I've heard people at the OECD as a joke use the word Peru to talk about the UK. But it's because of this centralization, which has happened for very complicated reasons over many, many decades. It's not a recent phenomenon. But one of my arguments, and I'm not a political scientist, I didn't come to this when I worked on my book. My book is about data, 2,000 sources of evidence, huge quantities of data. I had 25 people doing calculations from many different databases for me. I came to this conclusion when I was working through the book, that many of the countries which are broadly federal type systems they've been lucky, they've had better adjustment systems to deal with the shocks of modern globalization. Countries like the USA, of course, Canada, Germany, Austria, Australia, Belgium. Also centralized countries like the Nordic countries or the Netherlands where I was working, they look centralized, but in actual fact they're extremely bottom-up, how they're organized politically. The socio-economic councils at the local level, where the employers, the trade unions, the educational institutions, the small business, the entrepreneurs network all come together to identify the priorities for their localities. They make their recommendations, which are mandatory on the next level of governance upwards. They're extremely bottom-up in nature. And then there are also countries which in some sense look like us, Japan, South Korea, France, but they've been rapidly decentralizing for almost 2 decades, which has helped them cope rather better than us. And the best description of this is just an example from England, but it was in The Economist in 2013. What it said was, the analogy is to think about is the 2 codes of rugby. I mean, you can see where the rugby is. The blue is rugby league, this is within England, and the red would be rugby union. And the argument to The Economist was, to an outsider, all kinds of rugby just look the same game. But if you are a rugby player or a rugby fan, they're completely different games. The rules are different, the incentive systems, the points are different, the clubs are different, even the pitches are different, the number of players are different. All the surrounding social and financial infrastructure, all the cultural infrastructure around the games is completely different. They basically coexist. But the interaction between the 2 games, of course there's a small number of players and coaches that switch codes, but the vast majority of people who play different codes never change. And I think it's a very good analogy to what is happening within the UK. And an extra aspect of this is, because of this, it's very hard to objectively say things about the UK in terms of how we're doing. You know, are we lifting off like space shuttle? The right-hand image, are we in a traffic jam? Or are those cars all going very quickly? Lots of congestion, but we're moving very fast, or are we moving very slow? Are we in the middle? What? The curious thing about the UK is that the economic realities don't reflect our national narratives. And I'm using national in the sense of the United Kingdom here. We tend to describe things by flipping. We're either world beaters or we're disaster. The kind of stuff you read in the press. It's always like this. The most remarkable thing, when you look at all the data weights from the OECD, the World Bank, whatever, is that the UK is just kind of average on almost everything. We're not particularly remarkable on really anything. Productivity is about average, wages and incomes are about average, public participation, quality of life is about average. I'm talking about OECD, EU comparisons. We're kind of average. Even levels of migration are about average. It's the one remarkable thing of the UK is, in so many ways, how unremarkable we are. But then there are things where we are very, very good, and some things where we're not very good. But the overriding thing is that we're rather average. Now, it's hard to say that culturally, but that's what the numbers tell us. Why is that? Because the globalization shocks on the UK have been so asymmetric that London and its immediate hinterland has outperformed EU and OECD economies by almost the same amount that a lot of the UK has underperformed exactly the same benchmarks. So over a 40 or 50-year period, relative to many of our competitors, the UK has actually not gone anywhere. Of course, we're much richer than we used to be in absolute terms, absolutely. But since the mid-1960s, we've only overtaken one country, New Zealand. New Zealand's almost caught us again. Because the benefits of globalization have been so localized within the UK. Primarily London and its immediate hinterland, and many parts of the UK have largely lost out or haven't benefited to the same extent. That's the way to think about it. London's global city role, of course, is an extreme case. So what you get is, instead of a mix of benefits moving in all different directions, which is what most people anticipate, it's not really happened. These things have been very localized in the UK to a greater extent than almost any other OECD country. I mean, Japan is twice the size of us, one of the world's most equal countries. Australia is vastly bigger than we are, and it's very, very equal across places. Canada is very equal. It's the UK which is such an outlier. Why is this? Well, we have lots of narratives, and I don't think they're particularly useful. They appear in the press. One is that, well, you don't want to spread the jam too much. You want to focus everything in one place, and then eventually it'll kind of filter out. Yes, but it depends on the viscosity of the jam and the porosity and the resistance of the bread. You can't simply say, put it all in one place and it'll spread. We don't know that. Some say, yeah, but we've got London as a kind of a motor of the economy, driving everybody along, some sort of cascading effect, trickle-down type of effect. It's not happened. 25, 30 years of data since modern globalization, it's simply not happened. The last one is that it's kind of a dark star, kind of sucking everything in. This comes from somebody called Tony Travers at LSE, and it was picked up by Vince Cable. It's not true. If you look at the classic one is clever kids graduate from university and go to London. Actually, interregional migration of university graduates into London hasn't changed in about 40 years. It's about 0.5% of the London labour market, and it stays very constant. Most students stay home. Scottish students tend to study in Scottish universities and go into employment or set up businesses in Scotland. Students in the north of England do the same. These labour markets kind of coexist in parallel. So, lots of the standard explanations in the UK, what it could be, I argue don't work. As I say, my book is extremely detailed on these things. And how do we think about it in terms of ways forward? So to think about where we're going to be in 2025, the UK as a whole, Scotland, England, whatever configuration we're talking about in a decade from now. The first thing is that the EU referendum and also the Scottish independence referendum, I think, reflect a fundamentally different geography of perceptions, how people see themselves relative to others within the country and beyond the country. When you take the Brexit vote, for example, my guess is that most people have voted leave in the regions which are far more dependent on European markets did not know that. There will be some people maybe did, but I think genuinely most people, I mean, when I've shown these graphs before, people have been shocked. I think most people didn't know that. Part of the reason is that globalization, as we understand it, outsourcing to China and all of that, is not what most people in the UK do. Businesses in London are routinely on the phone to Ulaanbaatar and Taiwan and El Salvador and so on. This is what they're doing. But businesses in places like Hull don't do that. They're on the phone to people in Leeds and every now and then to people in Rotterdam. They've actually become more Europeanized, whereas London has become more globalized, and they're fundamentally different things. Which means whatever the outcome of the forthcoming negotiations are going to be, of course it's impossible to predict these, the point is that the places which voted leave are potentially much more vulnerable if anything doesn't work out. So the risks are very, very high. We have a country which already looks like that, and the danger is we'll become like that. And from a governance point of view, this is a real problem. So, what do I think? The UK is not an optimal size from a currency point of view. Optimal currency arguments, many people are familiar with that. It's not. The variation in productivity at the local area level within the UK is as big as across the whole of the Eurozone. And we are the only country where that is true. We are not an optimal governance structure. for the realities in the country. We have a top-down governance failure because we're overly centralized, and being overly centralized and top-down limits our ability to coordinate horizontally between places, between institutions, between different actors. In places, I've used examples like Australia, United States, Germany, Belgium, this is kind of natural. Their governance system naturally allows these things to happen. So to have governance systems in the UK, which over the next 10 or 20 years are going to become much more effective and responsive to the realities that people are going to face, I think what we need is to fundamentally change the governance system of the United Kingdom. And I'm not a political scientist. I came to this after looking at thousands of pieces of data. So I came to the view that we need a constitutional convention, not from a constitutional position, but looking at what the numbers tell us. And of course, the Scottish independence referendum actually uncovered many of these issues. They're very real issues about the currency, lenders of last resort, about trade relationships, and of course, everything is thrown up in the air again by the Brexit vote. You know, these are incredibly complicated things now, but they're fundamental questions about what it is to be a nation state. You go back to 1848, the Treaty of Westphalia, they were asking these questions then. And we're kind of back at the same point again suddenly. And in a country like the UK, these questions are very real and they're not going to go away. Why? Because markets are too powerful. Markets are too powerful. So I think we need to find ways to change our institutional structures. This is, for example, the development approach. We've got the devolved powers of the devolved administrations. In England, we've got local enterprise partnerships. We've got all these other things, Northern Powerhouse and so on. You know, I'm broadly in favour of all of these things. My view is it's not nearly enough. These have to be a starting point to a much more radical and fundamental transformation of how we understand our own country. Because the country we have today is not the country we had 40 years ago. It's just fundamentally different. And to think about where we're going to be. So the various initiatives which are taking place around thinking about the different positioning of Scotland, for example, within the United Kingdom, the different role of maybe the devolved assemblies in Wales, Northern Ireland, the city-region agenda in England, the possibilities of greater autonomy vis-à-vis the London economy, all of these things are suddenly in the mix. But my argument is they have to be in the mix and we have to go much, much further. Why? Because something which is as big and as profound and as nightmarishly and fiendishly complex as this, we can mess this up all too easily. If we do it piecemeal, bit by bit, what's politically expedient, unwinding those after 5 or 10 years is going to be orders of magnitude harder than actually stepping back and looking at it properly. I think, for example, EVEL, English votes for English laws, I'm against that way of thinking because it understands the potential federal structure of the UK as the 4 nations. My view is you need some sort of federal system which builds in and explicitly takes account and mobilizes the devolved administrations. Absolutely, but you also need something, it doesn't necessarily have to be the same thing at all, but something which has a similar type of galvanizing effect of the city regions in England. Because otherwise you're always going to have many parts of the country looking longingly and not comfortably at what's going on in the London area. That's a recipe for stoking division, politically and economically. So for me, these things have to be thought about in a much broader way, which we have to find ways of aligning incentives. How do you do that when the London economy is as big as the next 14 city economies in the UK put together? The next 14 biggest cities, Glasgow, Edinburgh, Manchester, Bristol, you add them all together, London's bigger than all of them. How do you think of a governance system that can deal with these things? The only thing worse than the top-down, centralized, space-blind governance system when the internal economy is like that so much is one which is fragmented and like that. That's even worse. The extreme case is the Detroit problem, where a city itself becomes bankrupt. So these are the kind of things I've been thinking about. It's been a long journey, But we need to find ways to move to something, those images on the left, you can have differentiation, things which are different jigsaw pieces, different configurations, but in some sense they have to fit together as a workable whole. And I don't think you can do that without a proper constitutional convention that thinks about everything. I even use the phrase with my students, post-Brexit, post-Barnett. I'm sorry. Because that's the level we need to think about. The danger is piecemeal and ad hoc will lead to this. And all that will do is kick these things down the road, and next time you come around to try and deal with them, the problems will be even greater than they are now. Okay?